Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Millennial in the Middle. We've got a good one for you today. We are going to talk about a topic that is in the middle of the current political debate right now. We're going to look at it from a historical perspective, and because of that historical perspective, I find myself somewhere in the middle. Now, I don't have a guest on today's episode. Like I said, some of these episodes we're going to bring on guests with unique and interesting perspectives and see how they think through a specific topic. Or it's going to be me using that historical look and not have a guest, and I'm going to have a little more stuff prepared for us, and that's what we're looking at today. This topic that we're going to dive into, I've had some personal experiences with that I'm going to share, and I'll tell you, it's something I do feel very passionate about. Now, like I said from the beginning, in the rules I said at the beginning of this podcast, right? We'll quickly go over the rules again. Number one, no name calling, right? The minute you call someone a name, you lose credibility. Number two, there's a difference between being passionate and being angry or divisive. There's the ability that we all have to have political conversations about tough topics in a calm, level-headed, cool manner, and that's how I'm going to do it today. And the third rule being, always we are going to approach these topics with the desire to learn, listen, and understand before trying to force your opinion on someone else. Now, those rules are in place for me, right? I am not doing this today to change your mind or to try and tell you you need to think the way I am. I'm not in a debate right now talking you into something. This hopefully just gives you a little bit more light on a topic that maybe changes the way you think, and you decide where you fall in here. And I think, like almost everything we're going to talk about on this podcast, it's not black or white. It's not red or blue. It's way, way more complex than that, and most issues that we face are that way. And I think that's how you'll see me end up in this today. So with that said, I hope you're getting to know me a little bit better. My goal is that in each of these episodes, you start to learn a little bit more about me that helps you understand, well, with that perspective, I could see why you would feel that way. Let's face it, our background, our upbringing, the way our parents raise us, all of those things affect the way we think, our opinions, and change the people that we become. So I want to tell you about what I do. For the last 7 years, I have spent my career. Now I'm 28 years old, by the way. I started this pretty early, but I am a professional speaker. In fact, I worked for an investment company, and I traveled literally the world, speaking to businesses and individuals at events, seminars, conferences, training people, speaking. I love it. Yeah, this is my passion. I'll tell you, it's been fun for me because for a while now I have, every time I've been on stage speaking to a crowd, which by the way, I totally prefer. I know that, there's thousands of you listening to this podcast. I wish you were in front of me right now so I could see you and feel that and make that connection, but I do my best over this, virtual setting, or if you're just listening to the podcast. Now, with that said, I love speaking. It's what I do. I started doing it very early in life, but professionally for the last 6-7 years. And what I found is that it's been really fun for me on this podcast to speak on things that are me. I'm not representing a company. I'm not representing anything else. This is just me talking about my opinions, where I fall on these things, and hopefully that benefits you. Now, one of the things that I did when I was speaking a lot is I traveled and was on the road a ton. In fact, I was on the road for a stretch of about 5 years for over probably about 3 weeks a month. In that period of time, I spoke in 47 of 50 states. In fact, I wasn't going to do this, but if you want to put it in the comments, I'd love to see you make your guesses on the 3 states that I haven't spoke in. I don't know a prize off the top of my head. $100 gift card to the place of your choice, Amazon. Why not? $100 gift card to Amazon for someone that can guess the 3 states that I have not spoken in correctly. First person wins. Why not? I've spoken in almost 10 countries. In fact, I was just looking at 10 different countries, and in the U.S. specifically, I saw a list of the top 100 most populated metropolitan areas in the United States. Of those 100, I looked at the list, I had spoken in 91 of those. And it's pretty cool for me. Now, what that led to is there's no doubt I lived a pretty sheltered life. right? I grew up in the suburbs of Utah, outside of Salt Lake City. And all of a sudden, especially for this 5-year stint of traveling as much as I was, I got to get a feel for our country in a different way. I got to see all sorts of different places, but not as a tourist, as someone that was actually meeting with people, hosting events, going all over. I loved it. And what I found is that our country really is so regional in a lot of ways. I mean, think about it. I would speak for a few days, for example, in Alabama, and have a crowd where I was up there speaking and I felt like I was a Baptist preacher, and I'm up there talking about investment strategies, and I got people going, amen, hallelujah, yeah, that's right? And then the next few days, all of a sudden I'm in Boston, right off a Harvard campus, and I got a group of intellectuals with their arms crossed, scowls on their faces, looking at me like, you don't know what you're talking about. Couldn't have been more polar opposite. Or then you're, in Knoxville, Tennessee. You're all of a sudden in San Diego, California, Seattle, Washington, and feeling, in a short amount of time, the differences that we all have. And then even within some of the cities I was in, some differences that we saw there. In fact, I remember a few different times, one in particular, where I spoke at an event at a hotel. I won't tell you where I was, but I spoke at this event. There were about 200 people there. And if I were to take a quick glance at the audience, I would probably tell you that about 190 of the 200 people were white. I then had another event about 15 minutes away from that hotel. Same day, and about 200 people. Again, the same about number of people in that event. And probably 190 of that room were black. And why? Because it was marketed to different zip codes. And all of a sudden, it just hit me like, man, 15 minutes away, I just did an event where 95% of my group was white, and now I'm holding this event and 95% of my group is black. And I know I didn't see that in Utah, but that feel of, the differences, experiencing that really for the first time. And I'll tell you, there's one time that I really remember that stuck out to me as it relates to race. And this is an experience that I still really remember, and it brings back some major memories as I do it. I was in Virginia. Now, for those of you that know Virginia well, Virginia is kind of funny because there's this point, there's Northern Virginia, Arlington, close to DC, that area, right? And then you start to drive south, and you almost feel immediately that you've gone from the East Coast to the South. And, I'm not from the South. I've never lived in the South, although I do have a lot of people tell me that I can turn on a little bit of that Matthew McConaughey voice if I try hard. And when they say that to me, I say, all right, right? No, I mean, I realize I've got a little bit of a Southern drawl. Sometimes people think I'm from the South, but I'm not, right? And I started to drive south, and, Richmond, Virginia Beach, all of a sudden you find yourself in a place just a few hours away from each other that feels so much different. Now, I was in Virginia Beach, and it was a Sunday afternoon. I just had lunch with some other coworkers, and all of a sudden, coming through, we're right on like Ocean Boulevard, the street that goes right along the beach. There was a rally of Confederate flags. Now, this was right after the killing of Freddie Gray. This was really toward the beginning. This was in 2015, summer of 2015, at the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement. And there was then basically a parade or rally, a drive-by of a bunch of trucks and a bunch of motorcycles, all flying the Confederate flag. And it was this most surreal setting for me because I felt in that moment so much hate. I felt this divisiveness. I felt this hatred. I felt uncomfortable. I'll tell you, I felt sick to my stomach. And what really was crazy to me is I was walking down the sidewalk next to a black family. And I remember looking at them thinking, I know how I feel right now. And I can't imagine what they must be feeling. And it was this moment of, man, I've never seen this in Utah quite like it. This was now 5 years ago. And this left an impression on me. And in the last several years, we've had a lot of debate around the Confederate flag. We've also had a lot of debate over our history, whether we erase our history, whether it's something that we remember, that we honor. And this is what I want to talk about today. This mindset of how do we remember our history while at the same time recognizing that these men, a lot of times, like the founding fathers that we're going to talk about in a bit, were imperfect then just as we are imperfect now. And I want to talk about what all this means. So you're going to find I'm somewhere in the middle on this, and I want to start by talking about the Confederate flag. What does that symbol represent? Now, we talked a couple episodes ago with Michael Henry, the Marine, right, about what the American flag meant to him. And we discussed that the American flag represents different things to a lot of people. And I understand that the Confederate flag in the same way represents different things to different people. But I think there's some history behind that symbol and history behind how that flag has been used and applied in modern society that might change the way you think about it. So a quick little lesson on flags in general. This is kind of interesting. Mark Leipson, he wrote a book, he's a historian, called Flag, An American Biography. And he basically talked about how for the first third of our nation's history, from about 1777 to the beginning of the Civil War in 1861, flying the American flag for individual Americans was almost unheard of. No one flew the flag. I didn't know that. I actually learned that studying for this podcast here. That wasn't commonplace. And interestingly enough, it didn't become common to start displaying the flag as a citizen until the Civil War. It was flown by the military, but all of a sudden it started being flown by individual citizens. And what happened is when the Confederacy was formed, an enemy flag was formed within our own nation. So you think about it, we win the American Revolution, the British are thousands and thousands of miles away on the other side of the pond. There was no need to display this American flag, right? But all of a sudden now we found ourselves in a civil war, and the minute there was an enemy flag being flown, all of a sudden what did Americans, Northerners in the Union do? They started flying the American flag. I think that's really interesting. And one of the first things the Confederacy did when they broke away is they chose a flag. Now, it is important to note that the flag that the Confederacy used for most of the Civil War is not the Confederate flag that you see today. There are some similarities, but the Confederate flag has changed over the years as well. And there is no doubt that the Civil War is a dark mark on our history. To be totally honest, I love American history. I don't like Civil War history all that much. Because to me, there's not a good guy and a bad guy. Like, as an American, I read about World War II, and it's really easy to think, oh, the Nazis are the bad guys and we're the good guys, right? But when you read the Civil War, they're all Americans. It's brother fighting against brother. I'll be honest, it's kind of depressing. And so I haven't studied it all that much, right? But we've got to address these things that may not be as great to think about or as pretty on paper, right? It's definitely true that history is written by the victors, and we have a tendency to either glorify those that we want to glorify or make people into villains that we claim to be the bad guys, right? And unfortunately, it just like life isn't that simple, history isn't that simple either. Now, when the Civil War ended, the use of the Confederate flag really went away. They were the losers. There wasn't a place to fly the Confederate flag because the whole idea of trying to break the country apart anymore, the goal was now to bring it back. Now, by the way, one of the worst things the South ever did was assassinate Abraham Lincoln. I realize it wasn't the South as a whole, it was one person, right? But the South would have been a lot better off in the part directly following the Civil War had they had Abraham Lincoln's mindset, perspective, and really political ability to bring people together with his blueprint to Reconstruction. Andrew Johnson didn't look at it as nicely, right? But one of the things that happened in the aftermath of the Civil War is the Confederate flag went into obscurity. It wasn't flown anymore. And by the way, 5 years after the Civil War, they weren't making statues for Confederate war heroes. Again, they were losers, right? Now, the Civil War, or the Confederate flag, started to kind of resurface a little bit in the early 1900s, but didn't really pick up much popularity. That popularity really waned during World War II, because in World War II, it was America. We had a common enemy, right? We were all one. But what immediately happened after World War II is all of a sudden, our country started to move into the civil rights age, right? In 1948, the Confederate flag experienced a resurgence. A lot of this was due to a certain man, Strom Thurmond, who was a Dixiecrat, a Southern Democrat that was in support of not changing the South, pro-segregation, and fighting for, the Jim Crow laws that were openly racist, right? And so with that, there were a few things that took place. All of a sudden, the Confederate flag became a symbol of this Dixiecrat movement. It became a symbol of, we don't want to change. We want to keep things the way they are. And it really built this movement devoted to supporting Jim Crow laws and other racist policies like it. Now, I think most people don't really know that, right? When a lot of these Confederate statues were built is in the middle of the civil rights movement, as a way to say, hey, we're not okay with that. In fact, in 1956, Georgia's state flag was changed. They basically went through and changed the state flag to include the Confederate flag in the state flag. Now, I want to read a few things here. In 2000, by the way, the Georgia state flag today, if you look it up, is not the same. It was changed in 2001 originally, but then 2003 as well. The 2003 version is what you will see today. But if you go back and look at the version of the flag that they passed in 1956, the Confederate flag was prominent. According to a 2000 research report done by the Georgia Senate, what they said was that the 1956 flag was adopted in an era when the Georgia General Assembly was entirely devoted to passing legislation that would preserve segregation and white supremacy. James McKay, one of the House members, basically announced, he went and said he opposed the change at that time. He said there was only one reason for putting it on the flag on there. Like the gun rack in the back of a pickup truck, it telegraphs a message. Additionally, the 2000 report concluded that the 1956 General Assembly changed the state flag during an atmosphere of preserving segregation and resentment of the United States government's rulings on integration. The changed flag was seen as a gesture of defiance in the face of the federal government's initial enforcement of Brown versus Board of Education. All of a sudden you start to think of that symbol was being used during that period of time to promote and further segregation, to promote these racist policies, right? And as that then happened, basically a lot went down to where Georgia, basically it was said by the then governor at the time, Marvin Griffin, he said, the rest of the nation is looking to Georgia for the lead in segregation. Man, think about that. The governor of Georgia in 1956 said, we're going to be the leaders here for segregation. Now, when you start to think about the Confederate flag that way, all of a sudden it changes a little bit your mindset of what you might feel about it. Now, the Georgia flag was changed in 2001. It was changed in 2003. And by the way, this is in the news right now because the Mississippi state flag was just changed in July of 2020. This just happened, right? This is something we've been talking about. Now, here's my stance on this. People always ask me, am I going to stay neutral in this podcast? Not always, right? I'll give you my feelings. Now, anytime I give you my feeling, I hope I don't lose audience members on that. I know I've actually chatted with some people that listen to this podcast that are from Texas, that are from North Carolina and Florida, right? I realize the counter argument that the Confederate flag to a lot of people represents their forefathers that fought. It's an ancestry thing. It's your culture. It's your heritage of being proud that you're from the South. And I understand that. That's your perspective. I can't change that. But for me, it's how that symbol is used. And if that symbol is going to be used to promote hate, to promote violence, to promote racism in the same way that it was in the 50s when Georgia changed their flag and said, we are going to lead the segregation movement, right? Then that for me is when it becomes not okay. Now, I'm not a fan of the Confederate flag. And why? Because of my personal experience with it. Now, I realize my personal experience is really minor. I've never lived in the South, and I'm not black. But that day in Virginia Beach, watching people in response to Black Lives Matter protests around the death of a black man, Freddie Gray, and using that flag as a symbol to say, hey, here's where we stand on this, to me, I'll never forget that feeling. It just didn't sit right. Now, you're probably saying, well, at this point, Connor, you've kind of told us how you feel. How do you say you're in the middle? Now, what's interesting is what started about this argument of Confederate flag, Confederate statues, has now gotten more extreme. In fact, during this time period, Donald Trump said once, in this argument of protecting our monuments, protecting Confederate statues, Donald Trump came out and said, what's next? If we start taking down Confederate statues, what's to stop us from saying the Washington Monument, the Jefferson Memorial, they should be taken down as well? And what's interesting is I think a lot of Americans, me included, heard Donald Trump say that and were like, oh, that would never happen. Well, it's 2020 and it's happening. There are people right now that are talking about the legacy of men like George Washington, of men like Thomas Jefferson. And they're they're saying, well, they were slave owners, they were racist, and because of that, we shouldn't honor or celebrate their legacy. I talked about this in the introductory episode of this podcast when I got a lot of crap for going to Mount Rushmore and how that was turned, right? In fact, when Donald Trump went to speak at Mount Rushmore at the July 4th event in 2020 this year, right? What happened was in July 4th, 2020, CNN basically said that Donald Trump will speak in front of a monument celebrating two slave owners, and basically taking those two men, probably two of the greatest founding fathers, and breaking down their legacy to just the fact that they were racist slave owners. That to me is where I all of a sudden go, wow, hold on, that's too far. And here's where the extremes really start to play in, right? There's got to be some sort of middle ground. Now, let's look at some history of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson as it relates to them owning slaves. Now, I want to kind of give you an analogy here. Now, I know this is going to sound like I'm totally trivializing slavery, and I'm not. But I want to prove a point here. Have you ever gone through old pictures, like an old photo album, or found a picture of yourself from 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago? For my boomer listeners, maybe it was 50 years ago. And you saw a picture like that, and you thought to yourself, what was I wearing? Or what was my hairstyle doing there? What was I even thinking, right? I have thought that as I have looked at a picture of myself from just like 5 years ago. Like, I thought those pants were cool. I thought those baggy Hollister shorts, cargo with 12 different pockets on each leg were cool. And I go, man, what was I thinking? But then you go, well, at the time, that was cool. We've all looked at pictures of our parents and been like, man, nice outfit, Dad. And they're like, actually, that was like the coolest jacket around then. Now, here's why I say that. We cannot judge people of the past by today's standards. It's unfair to them because we cannot relate to their perspective. The same type of respect that we give each other here on this podcast of I respect others with different perspectives because I can't relate to that. We have to offer our founding fathers and those men and women that came before us the same ability to say, hey, we can't judge your perspective. We weren't there. We don't get it in the same way. Now, we absolutely can go, well, the argument is, well, slavery is just morally wrong. It doesn't matter when that was the case. That's abhorrent, which I agree. But what's interesting is a lot of founding fathers actually agreed with that statement as well. In fact, George Washington, he said a couple cool things in his life where he said, I want to read a couple quotes here, and this is just from the Mount Vernon Library. He said, I never mean, unless some particular circumstance should compel me to it, to possess another slave by purchase. it being among my first wishes to see some plan adopted by the legislature by which slavery in this country may be abolished by slow, sure, and imperceptible degrees. And in fact, when George Washington died at the age of 67, in his will, he included a provision that he would free the 123 enslaved people that he owned outright. Now, another interesting tidbit about George Washington. George Washington became a slave owner at 10 years old. Now, how's that the case? He wasn't out buying slaves at 10 years old. His father passed away and he inherited that. That was part of his family. It was part of his upbringing. Now, that does not make it okay in the least bit. But my point is, as a 10-year-old, if that were such a part of life where all of a sudden you now just inherit it, it's hard to even imagine that perspective, right? Now, here's what's interesting. This podcast is about finding the middle ground. And a big part about finding the middle ground is compromising, right? The founding fathers were so good at being in the middle. They were amazing at compromising. And they knew that the only way to truly progress was to find some middle ground, right? If you look and you study of, the early days of our country with, the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitutional Convention, you see two sides that are always competing against each other. In fact, for those of you that are into Hamilton, right, our millennials, we see this in Jefferson's mindset and Hamilton's mindset. Those two were the beginning of a two-party political system, right? And you see these different sides trying to find a middle ground. In fact, in Hamilton, you see George Washington trying to be the referee and trying to be the mediator behind these two very, very smart men, very, very influential men, but that had very, very different opinions, perspectives, and ideas for how to move our country forward. And these men had to learn how to compromise. They had to find out how to come together. I'll tell you this, if our current political climate and our current political leaders were tasked with the same task our founding fathers were, I do not think we'd have a country today. Because we have so many people in our nation right now that are unwilling to budge at all. I want you to think about some of the compromises that the founding fathers made. For example, there obviously was a big difference in thinking in the northern states and the southern states as early as the Constitutional Convention. And slavery was one of the top issues for that. It was their economy, right? But to take something maybe not as divisive or not as, making people pick sides, think about the mindset of those going into the Constitutional Convention of the difference of the big states and the little states, right? Those that had a large population, those that had a small population. They came into the Constitutional Convention all representing their state, but they had things that they wanted to fight for, right? And so you think the large states, how did they want the votes to be counted? How did they want to have a say in the government? They wanted to have a say by saying, well, it should be proportional to our population. And if we have more people, we should have a whole lot more say than Rhode Island does. Have you seen how small Rhode Island is? And Rhode Island's sitting there going, well, no, we're a state the same way that you are. We have our own state legislature. We have our own state leaders. We don't want to be bullied on and picked on by the big states. And in fact, if we allow that to happen, then we might not as well be here, right? Because the big states are just going to control anyway. What did our founding fathers do? Rather than putting these two sides never going to budge and never going to come together, they said, look, what if we do this with our legislature? What if we have two different houses, right? What if we have the Senate, which we're going to make equal, and we'll give 2 representatives to each state? And then what if we have the House that is based proportionally on how many people live in your state? And they came to an agreement. Now, of course, it wasn't that simple. There's a lot more that goes into all of this, right? But to break that down, they made a compromise that ultimately made things work. Here's why I say that. That type of mentality is what leads to progress. That type of mentality is what got us to the point that we're in today. Now, what's interesting is in that quote I just read from George Washington, he said that my goal is that this will be adopted by the legislature, that they'll get rid of slavery. But I think they knew that at that time, if that was a make or break, this country wouldn't have been formed. So they didn't push for it. They might have had those opinions, but they knew that it wasn't going to happen right now. And what did George Washington say? I hope that by slow and sure, imperceptible degrees, that this will happen moving forward. And in fact, Thomas Jefferson has a very similar quote. This is from the Smithsonian, this is from Jefferson's library. He says, Jefferson knew slavery was wrong, that he was wrong in profiting from the institution, but apparently could see no way to relinquish it in his lifetime. He thought abolition of slavery might be accomplished by the young men of the next generation. They were qualified to bring the American Revolution to its idealistic conclusion because, he said, those young Virginians, and I like this quote, it's so like Revolutionary War time, the way it's written, right? Old English. He said, these young Virginians sucked in the principles of liberty as if it was their mother's milk. Now, it's kind of an interesting analogy, right? But what he's saying is, this generation that's coming after us, they are born with the understanding of freedom. They are born with the understanding of liberty. And I think because it's becoming more and more ingrained in them, I think they can pull it off. And now here we are today, and the thought of slavery is abhorrent, right? There's not even something that we can imagine is acceptable, right? And that's happened over time. Not to say it was okay then, right? But that's something that took place. Now, in an article in the Smithsonian Magazine by Stephen Ambrose, I think he summed all this up pretty well. He said, the Washington Monument and the Jefferson and Lincoln Memorials remind us that greatness comes in different forms and at a price. Jefferson, by his words, gave us aspirations. Washington, through his actions, showed us what was possible. And Lincoln's courage turned both into reality. Man, I love that. Basically said Jefferson wrote the words, all men are created equal, right? And so many people will say, man, how could someone who wrote those words own slaves? But he aspired, right? He knew what was to come. George Washington then by action made the steps slowly over his life as he felt the guilt. He said that his only regret in life was that he owned slaves. And so what did he do in his will? He freed them, right? And then Lincoln was able to come together with, he says, the courage, but I would also say the political skill. And by political skill, the ability to build relationships and communicate and connect with people in the middle and bring people together to bring progress, to bring change. And then it finishes and says, slavery and discrimination cloud our minds in the most extraordinary ways, including a blanket judgment today against American slave owners in the 18th and 19th centuries. That the master should be judged as lacking in the scope of their minds and hearts is fair. Indeed, it must be insisted upon. But that doesn't mean we should judge the whole of them by only this part. I really, really like that quote. I hope that I am remembered for my strengths, not my weaknesses. And I think we all wish that we would be afforded that same notion, right? Now, I don't do this at the end of the day to convince you of anything. I do this to hope to educate, to inspire, to uplift, to maybe give you a different perspective on things. For me, when it comes to this issue, I see that we can't forget our history, right? We can't look at things in such a black and white way that we're never able to make any progress, right? But what I also believe, in fact, what I also believe is that those symbols, if they're used for certain things, can really, really be hurtful. That day in Virginia Beach, I remember, and I remember as a white person, and to be honest, it didn't really affect me. I can only imagine what it would feel like for someone, those people next to me on the street, that black family, that I know it did. But I also know I'm not going to go to the other extreme to say I want to dishonor our founding fathers, or I want to take down the Washington Monument, or I believe Mount Rushmore should be destroyed. I loved this quote. I saw this recently on social media. Someone said, history is not there for you to like or dislike. It is there for you to learn from it. And if it offends you, even better, because then you are less likely to repeat it. It's not yours to erase. It belongs to all of us. So, what are we going to do? Folks, I hope this has been something that you've enjoyed. I hope you know that, you don't have to be, you can be a Republican and be opposed to the Confederate flag. And guess what? You can be a Democrat and not think that Jefferson and Washington are villains. This is not a red or a blue matter. There's always somewhere in the middle. However you find that, I hope that you do it from a place of love, understanding, and a real desire to change and improve and make progress. Thanks for listening. I've got some great episodes coming up. In fact, the next episode, this guest, I'm not going to give it away. We're going to talk about something that I feel is one of the best examples right now of a very gray area when it comes to how I feel about this topic. And I'm really, really excited to do it. Thanks for listening again. And until next time, clowns to the left me, jokers to the right. Here I am stuck in the middle with you. See you next time.